created to mark the 100th anniversary of the Lincoln Memorial. I had the pleasure of speaking there in May for the actual event, and when I talked to Margaret this year about the program we might create for August, we thought we would continue this anniversary year observance because it is unique and it has focused a huge amount of attention on French's statue and Bacon's building. Okay, so picture a scorching May morning 100 years ago as 50,000 people gather on a former swamp near the Potomac River in Washington to dedicate the Lincoln Memorial. The crowd will hear the U.S. Marine Band play Battle Hymn of the Republic, between speeches from an American president, a former president, and the head of a historically black college in Alabama, founded, by the way, under a land grant law signed by the man honored in the magnificent building that they were all there to see, the Lincoln Memorial, and of course the man, Abraham Lincoln. Under those circumstances, it should have been the perfect dedication for a magnificent building and for the great statue inside, but it was not, because it was brutally segregated. Black visitors who'd arrived early to secure good seats in the front were actually rousted out of their prime locations by mounted police and pushed to the back to benches without backs in a roped-off section in the rear, which the black press later nicknamed the Cour d'Afrique, but they weren't happy. So it's interesting, if you read reviews of the Lincoln Memorial, there's one set of reviews in the mainstream white press, and there's a whole other set of reviews in the black press. Nice statue, hideous ceremony, but it's in the book. The only black orator that day had his speech censored by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, William Howard Taft, who told him to take out all the, quote, propaganda about Lincoln's unfinished work on racial justice or forfeit his spot on the program. In fact, even though we're celebrating the 1922 dedication, it would take Marian Anderson's fully integrated 1939 Easter concert, and of course Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech in 1963 to begin rededicating the space and righting the original wrongs for the memorial and the country. Fully understanding the power of place, this is how Dr. King began.
50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro is not free.
Even in 1922, the dedication of a monumental statue of the great emancipator should have inspired more inclusivity. Surely that was what Daniel Chester French had wanted to convey with his statue, right? Well, what did the sculptor intend his greatest work of art to signify? For the answers, we must look to the genius who once lived and worked right here at Chesterwood, who in the studio behind you, in front of me, crafted a 13-inch high clay model of a seated Lincoln, arms resting on a chair of state, his original, and in many ways his final conception of the Lincoln Memorial. One burst of creativity that would change the American landscape. But Daniel Chester French was a man of many statues and very few words. He did not believe in explaining his art.
A statue ought to speak for itself. It's useless to explain to everyone what it means.
For the explanation behind the inspiration, we had to probe the very few things French said publicly and also look to his private letters. And believe us, he was not talkative in his correspondence either. He was about the gardens. The correspondence is filled with seed orders and stories about the trees and the plants, not about his work. So we've cherry-picked the rare insights French provided about his greatest subject, and we fashioned a kind of imaginary dialogue. So forgive us, but we're going to use that format to extract as much explanation as we can. So, interview format. Let me press you, Mr. French. What was your goal for the memorial?
Well, I wanted to show Lincoln's confidence in his ability to carry the thing through.
But what thing exactly?
Well, let me quote Emerson. You know, I sculpted him from life once. He liked the result. He said, "That is the way I look after I shave." That's the kind of reaction I like. As Mr. Emerson once said, a poet is entitled to credit for anything that anyone can find in his work. I feel the same way about my work.
Okay. Well, we know New Englanders don't like to talk too much, but if you have to sum up what you had in mind for the Lincoln Memorial in, I'm going to make it easy, just 4 words, what would you tell us?
Work over, victory his.
Yes, French actually said the things we just heard, and very, very little more. Fortunately, the statue, I know you admirers agree, spoke volumes. And of course, it earned rave reviews. Awe-inspiring, magnificent, colossal yet personal. That doesn't even include the congratulations that Dan received at the dedication from people who had known and seen Lincoln, like the great man's 79-year-old son, Robert, who was at the dedication. So since French left no paper trail, we wonder how he got the commission of the century in the first place. There was no formal competition, which was kind of standard for the day, especially with big works of art. At age 65, he was the first and only choice. Not because he was head of the National Arts Commission that hired the architect. He was, by the way, head of the National Arts Commission, but he resigned. Not because the architect that he selected in turn who in turn chose French as the sculptor was his longtime collaborator, Henry Bacon, who had designed the studio here at Chesterwood and the home at Chesterwood. Now, those things didn't hurt, for sure, but I would suggest that French got the job because he was the greatest living American sculptor, bar none. And because, frankly, with all of those official and unofficial titles he'd accrued, no one dared say he shouldn't get the job. Well, Gutzon Borglum wanted the commission, but he had to settle for Mount Rushmore. So French set to work in about 1915, crafting that preliminary clay model with Lincoln's gaze cast slightly downward, at ease but in command, weary but accomplished. And then he did 2 slightly refined enlargements. I'm sure you habitués of this area know that the enlargements are right inside the studio. You can probably see them later. After the 2 enlargements, again, he felt he had done the job.
Daniel Chester French to Henry Bacon, May 1915, quote, "It should interest you to know that I am making sketch models for the statue of Lincoln. At present, I'm feeling very encouraged, but I am suspicious of my enthusiasms. When I get anything that is worthwhile, I shall, of course, expect you to come up to Chesterwood and see what I have to offer."
Think about that. Bacon was allegedly the boss, but French said, come up and see the statue sometime. He didn't say, bring it down. So, suspicious or not, the basic design never really changed from that original conception. So where did the idea originate? French never said. He could see it in his mind's eye from the start, but was it perfect?
The more I study Lincoln, the bigger he seems. It is an absorbing subject and one that calls for the best that is in an artist. I appreciate the responsibility of making a statue of the nation's best loved man in such a beautiful building. All I can do is make it a little bit better than I know how. Besides, I could not make another as good as this, and it would be but little pleasure to make one inferior to it. I think I've struck it rather rich this time.
And he did. By the way, he resisted suggestions that he make it a standing rather than a seated Lincoln, arguing very logically that people would not be able to see a full figure Lincoln, at least the top of his head, from the bottom step of the plaza. Besides, he wanted some of the focus to rest on Lincoln's hands, one of them clenched to suggest power and the other open in friendship. Or so we infer, because again, he never said for sure.
I'm glad you like the hands. It has always seemed to me that the hands in portraiture were second only to the face in expression, and I depend quite as much upon them in showing character in force.
Now, he didn't really discuss how he was to dress Lincoln. It was another subject he focused on only in the art. But he did confide that he did not believe Lincoln was ever slovenly or sloppy, as some sculptors had recently suggested, only informal.
The mistake oftenest made by the sculptor is in thinking too much of the dress and too little of the man. I am all too aware of the great responsibility of making a statue of Lincoln to be put in such a place, and I feel at times inadequate. But I try not to think of these momentous things, but only of doing the best that is in me.
And the biggest, for this would be one of the most monumental portrait statues in America. An ambitious task for a 65-year-old, to be sure. But when French visited Washington and walked inside the 60-foot atrium in which it was scheduled to sit and saw it completed for the first time, he suddenly realized his original concept was just too small. The statue would be dwarfed in the great space. So what does America's greatest sculptor do? Does he build a small statue, too small statue? No, he said to the government, you've got to give me another $25,000 to enlarge the final statue from 13 feet to 19 feet. They didn't love the idea, but they did it. And it became the largest statue in America. And let's always remember, before it came fully to life in Washington, it had many birthplaces, many incubators, not only Chesterwood, but Manhattan, where he lived and worked half the year. I love his expression that, where do you live, Mr. French? Well, I live half the year in New York City, the other half in heaven, meaning the Berkshires. It also came to life in the Bronx, where his marble cutters, the Piccirilli brothers, carved away to the sound of Caruso records in an atelier near where Yankee Stadium is now, and also to the aroma of fresh-made pasta. French always managed to visit at lunchtime, by the way. And they worked on 240 tons of stone shipped from Georgia. So imagine 28 huge pieces, 21 of them carved after French's models. It was never assembled in full until it was shipped and installed at the Lincoln Memorial for the first time under DCF's supervision. It cohered perfectly. It was more than a triumph, it became an icon, in a way supplanting Uncle Sam as the national symbol, the backdrop to the American dream of government of, by, and for all people. And today, in an age when public statues have come and are coming down, even a few Lincoln statues, by the way, it remains our national touchstone, as indestructible as we like to think. And I wrote these words a couple of months ago, as we like to think we the people are. It would not have happened if all the pieces had not fit into place, literally, figuratively, politically, commercially, financially, and then climaxed at that dedication, imperfect as it was, a century ago. But let's take you back again 100 years to May 1922. When Americans, even those denied the full promise of Lincoln's new birth of freedom, even those rousted from the front of the crowd to the back of the crowd, could hear and read words that at least promised a more perfect union.
On that Memorial Day, organizers called on a poet to consecrate the memorial. The opportunity to recite a dedicatory poem had attracted 250 entries in what was the largest poetry competition ever held up until that point. The winner was 70-year-old Edwin Markham of Oregon, with verses that one critic hailed as, quote, the greatest poem ever written on the immortal martyr and the greatest that ever will be written.
Well, you can judge for yourself whether Markham surpassed Walt Whitman and Herman Melville and Carl Sandburg. Here is some of Edwin Markham's very long poem, Lincoln, the Man of the People, which became a bestseller, by the way, in book form, as recited aloud a century ago with only limited microphones. They had some, but not much, to 50,000 people.
When the northern mother saw the whirlwind hour greatening and darkening as it hurried on, she left the heaven of heroes and came down to make a man to meet the mortal need. She took the dried clay of the common road, clay warm, yet with the genial heat of earth, dashed through it all a strain of prophecy, tempered the heap with thrill of human tears, then mixed a laughter with the serious stuff. Into the shape she breathed a flame of light to light that tender, tragic, ever-changing face. Here was a man to hold against the world, a man to match the mountains and the sea, sprung from the west, up from the log cabin to the Capitol, one fire on his spirit, one resolve to send the keen axe to the root of wrong, clearing a freeway for the feet of God. The grip that swung the axe in Illinois was on the pen that set a people free. So came the captain with the mighty heart. He held his place, held the long purpose like a growing tree. And when he fell in whirlwind, he went down as when a lordly cedar, green with boughs, goes down with a great shout upon the hills and leaves a lonesome place against the sky.
In a way, those words were built on the image that Walt Whitman had created in 1865 of the captain who sacrificed all to save the ship of state. But Whitman would have been an interesting choice to read, was 30 years dead by the time the Lincoln Memorial came to life. Had he lived, maybe he would have been called on to recite his greatest hit. He never was able to complete a poetry reading in his lifetime without someone shouting, read, "O Captain, my Captain." Mm-hmm. So today we're going to ask Rufus Collins to read, "O Captain, my Captain."
O Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack. The prize we sought is won. The port is near. The bells I hear. The people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But O heart, 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 O the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. O Captain, my Captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills, for you bouquets and ribboned wreaths, for you the shores a crowding, for you they call the swaying mass, the eager faces turning. Here, Captain, dear Father, this arm beneath your head. It is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer, his lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm, he has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip, the victor ship comes in with object won. Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells! But I With mournful tread, walk the deck, my captain lies, fallen cold and dead.
Returning to the reality of the May 30th, 1922 event, we will spare you the speeches made that day by Warren Harding and William Howard Taft. It was Lincoln's speeches that got to be inscribed on the interior walls of the memorial. His greatest and his briefest masterpieces, the 271-word Gettysburg Address and the 700-word second inaugural, which is the third shortest inauguration day oration in American history, to George Washington's second and FDR's fourth. And beautifully carved they were by apprentices he had met here at Chesterwood, though the second inaugural famously has a typo, an E where an F should be, which visitors still challenge each other to find. Instead of future, it says euture. I've given it away. French, it might be noted, wanted 2 more Lincoln compositions inscribed. And he had his way about almost everything, but not about that. But they were very good ideas. So we wanted to present them to you. They're very brief and they're quite beautiful. The first is Lincoln's farewell to Springfield on February 11th, 1861.
And it's just become cool enough to put on this overcoat. I brought it. My friends, no one, not in my situation, can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born and one is buried. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of the divine being, whoever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me and remain with you and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell.
Dan French's second suggestion was a famous condolence letter to a Boston widow named Lydia Bixby, written just a few days after his 1864 re-election, to a woman who, Lincoln was told, had lost 5 of her soldier sons in the war to save the Union. You may know these words because the letter was later immortalized in Steven Spielberg's film Saving Private Ryan. It's the whole raison d'etre for the search for the Private Ryan because his brothers have been killed. And this is the letter.
Executive Mansion, Washington, November 21st, 1864. Dear Madam, I have been shown in the files of the War Department a statement of the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you are the mother of 5 sons who have died gloriously on the field of battle. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any words of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming. But I cannot refrain from tendering to you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic for which they died, and for which they died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memory of the loved and lost, and the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom Yours, very sincerely and respectfully, A. Lincoln.
We wonder how that could be resisted, but as it turned out, Mrs. Bixby may have been the madam of a brothel, and much worse, a Democrat, maybe even a Confederate sympathizer. It is said that when she got the Lincoln's letter, she threw it into the fire, because the original's never been found. Maybe she was embarrassed. It seemed that of her 5 sons, only 2, and I say that not disrespectfully, but only 2 had been killed in battle. Another was in a prison camp. One had already been discharged and was home, and yet another had deserted. As they say in Casablanca, Lincoln had been misinformed, I think. Today, some scholars actually think Lincoln didn't even write the Bixby letter, but delegated it to his private secretary. I don't happen to agree, but either way, it's great prose, even if Lincoln merely signed it, and even if all we have is the text printed in a Boston newspaper. It's well worth recalling, even if it's not worth carving in stone on the Lincoln Memorial. Others were indisputably deserving, like this next bit of extraordinary prose. Lincoln, at his apex, read aloud at Gettysburg on November 19th, 1863, and read aloud by a little boy in a movie, in a scene from a movie that helped cement the reputation not only of the speech, I would argue, but also the Lincoln Memorial, because it's one of the great scenes from the classic film Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. We are now engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far beyond our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
And finally, carved to the right of the statue, the canonical final thoughts from Lincoln's second inaugural on March 4th, 1865.
Fondly we do hope, fervently we do pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another, drawn with the sword, as it was said 3,000 years ago, so still must it be said. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations.
Speaking of lasting, Daniel Chester French fully expected his statue to sit in Washington, appreciated, revered, beloved forever. One of his last comments on the site was that he wished he could come back to see it in 1,000 years. That's exactly what a young African-American hotel bellhop from Washington was thinking when he visited the memorial late one night, shortly before departing for college and a career as a great crafter of words in his own right. When we were discussing what poet we would like to have as the reader at the Lincoln Memorial, this poet and this poem came to mind, except that it was written about 10 years after the dedication by a very young man. His name was Langston Hughes.
Let's go see old Abe, sitting in the marble and the moonlight, sitting lonely in the marble and the moonlight, quiet for 10,000 centuries, old Abe, quiet for 1,000,000 years, quiet, and yet a voice forever against the timeless walls of time, old Abe.
It's difficult, maybe impossible, to follow all these magnificent words. But let's close by remembering the brief but beautiful epigraph that a New York newspaper man, with very little advance notice, created at Daniel Chester French's request. I will add, because I know I have some Metropolitan Museum colleagues in the audience, that he was an art critic for the New York Herald Tribune, whom French befriended and who gave a rave review to Daniel Chester French's great milestone exhibition of Augustus St. Gaudens's sculpture in the Great Hall of the Met at the turn of the century. So he requested that Royal Cortisos, which is his name, write the plaque that beckons all of us as we approach his Lincoln.
In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever.
An enshrinement and a memory forged from the creative mind and gifted, expressive hands of Daniel Chester French, begun in the very place that we're all gathered this evening. Did it right here, just a few dozen feet from where we sit on the grounds. Yes, he may not have explained his work, and it's frustrating for a biographer, for a historian, probably for an audience, but he accomplished it, and he left us to discuss it. And in the words of one critic who commented on wondering what it would look like right before the dedication a century ago,
Mr. French has given the world such a vast and varied number of estimable works of art that it would require a masterpiece indeed to add anything to his fame.
and a masterpiece is exactly what Daniel Chester French created. Thank you. As you said, now we'll take it on the road. Right. So, Margaret, do we have time for
Yes,
questions?
you have
We
plenty
do.
of
If
time.
anyone has a question, yes, sir, you were first.
So did he speak that day?
Characteristically, he didn't. But the only thing I know is that he exchanged words. Well, I'm sure he chatted
No, I
on the
meant-
podium. Certainly didn't speak publicly. Wouldn't do it. He never spoke at his dedications. Matt?
I'd like to know where they took down the Lincoln statues that you referred to.
In Edwin Markham's home state, Oregon, and one in Madison, Wisconsin, students at the university. The statues that have come down have been marked 38 in red paint. And the reason is that Lincoln was president and approved the execution of 38 Sioux Native Americans in 1862. He pardoned more than 200. This was a case of a settler versus native dispute in Minnesota. It was not just a war among warriors, it also involved the attacks on women and children, the murder of women and children. So the people who could be proven or were beyond a doubt or a challenge were guilty of rape or murder of unarmed people were the ones whose execution Lincoln approved. And that's what's in renewed scrutiny, under renewed scrutiny now. And so some statues have been pulled down. One very close to here has been defaced. I don't know how many of you know the Bennington Museum, but there's a statue of Lincoln and two symbolic figures to his left and right. And on the day that the execution is marked, 38 was painted on the Lincoln figure. It wasn't toppled, but it was defaced. Yes, sir.
Yes, I mentioned to you earlier, I just finished your book, Lincoln on War, in which you set forth Lincoln's writings on the Civil War. Two questions. One, were you influenced at all in terms of what your perception of Lincoln had been after you read these writings? Did it change any of the perceptions you may have had about him? And the second question is, and some of it was commented on beautifully in some of the comments where he invokes the Lord. I understand Lincoln did not belong to a particular religion, but was he in fact a religious person? Because it comes across in so many of the speeches.
Now I know how President Biden feels when he gets two questions at once. He says, what was the first question again? So the first question, I can just very quickly say that I've been reading these things for 60 years. So assembling a core book about the writings on war, I guess the thing that was most illuminating to me was that so much of his focus after 1861 was on the Civil War. Whatever else he did, the Sioux uprising, the land grant colleges, the income tax, yes, he's the father of federal income tax, any of the things he did were just brief segues from the intense focus on ending the rebellion and restoring the Union. So Lincoln's religion, I mean, he said, when I do good, I feel good, and when I do bad, I feel bad. It's sort of Sermon on the Mount kind of religion. There have been lots of arguments about it over the years. He certainly did not belong to a church as an adult. As a child, he went to a Baptist church with his parents in Kentucky and Indiana. One reason is in Washington, he didn't like to disrupt services by attending. In fact, there's evidence that he used to sit in the pastor's office at some point with the door open to listen to sermons because he got to be an admirer of Phineas Gurley, his name was, in Washington. But I find that in his writings and his thoughts and the accepted words that he spoke conversationally, that he became more religiously inclined as the war continued, as the enormous sacrifices mounted. And I think in some ways, not to discredit his sincere, what I take to be his sincere thoughts that evolved, was that he could not bear to assume full responsibility for the carnage. It was as if, that's why he said the judgments of the Lord are
True and righteous.
true and righteous altogether, and God wills that this contest continue. He put it off on God because he couldn't accept the responsibility.
I mean, it's interesting though, because in his farewell in Springfield, it's quite a religious, and he gives the blessing and benediction on,
Yeah.
and he asks for it himself, with whose assistance I cannot succeed, I cannot fail.
Yeah, and
So-
he's remaining here and going with me.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's an amazing expression, and he said it, and then he was asked on the train to what he said, because he told the reporters he wasn't going to speak. And so they were all piled into the car, beginning their drinking, for the long trip to Washington, or at least the first round to Indianapolis. And one of the reporters was dispatched to go up front and say, well, they called him Mr. President, even as president-elect. You told us you weren't going to speak. What did you say? So he began to write it. And there was one transcribed version at the train station by a local paper. What he wrote or dictated, both in the train, was so much better. He was such a great editor. I'll tell you one more quick thing about that speech. I recited it once at an event in Houston for the dedication of the George H.W. Bush Library. And he came up afterwards and said, it was lovely, it was wonderful, and he was crying. And I said, Mr. President, what has moved you so much? He said, well, one of those speeches. And I said, Gettysburg, second inaugural? No, the farewell to Springfield. And I said, why that? He said, because Lincoln said, here my children have been born and one lies buried. And no one knows what it's like to leave your home and the grave of your child to go to Washington to be president. Which I just found very touching and unexpected, because of course his daughter died in Texas and was buried there. I've depressed everyone, no? Yes?
The statue of Lincoln with his hand on the young slave's head, wasn't that removed?
Removed. That's sort of the Bennington statue, but it's not an enslaved person's head. It's a symbolic victor. I think it's victory or inspiration or some symbolic statue. It's often been thought of as I'm sure there are statues like that. The one, I know which one you're talking about, the one in D.C.
Logan Circle.
Yeah, so the one in Washington is Lincoln with his hand outstretched and a half-dressed African-American man, either kneeling or rising. We don't know what the sculptor precisely meant. We do know, by the way, just to center it back on why we're here today, that when Daniel Chester French spent his time in Florence, he studied at the studio of the sculptor who had created that, and French got to see the model as he worked every day in Italy. So it's come under intense scrutiny. During the Black Lives Matter protests in Washington, there was a march toward the statue, and it was fenced in by DC police. They did a better job with that than they did with Capitol, but they weren't as outnumbered back then. And Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is the DC representative delegate to Congress, she's not a representative, no vote, wants it to come down, but there are a bunch of African-American historians who wanted to stay up. So that one, there is a statue nearby of the African-American educator. No, the woman who knew FDR, who sat in the parlor. Mary McLeod Bethune, thank you. Whose statue was just put in Statuary Hall to replace a Confederate general. Hi, Leo. I think you think we're done, right? That's your stroller. I think We're standing between you and a Prosecco, and Leo is ready to call it a day. Right, Leo? Okay.
Thank you again,
Thank you.
Harold and Rufus.
Even mine is.
A sort of spirit back.
We've seen this. We've seen it. And you might have seen it
I didn't see it. There were rabbits out there running around and
You're never supposed to perform by the it's sort of a rule. Completely up to date.
but
I had to wait. For
what's happening is
no, I didn't.
somebody down on Broadway was zooming along.
Interrupt Langston. I can't remember.
Yeah, they were all